Hi, I'm Bob the Hollow, here to talk about what we're going to call the Crossbreed Experiments. I've mentioned these experiments before, and I want to expand upon this theory, so let's first recap the basics before we can move on. We are first introduced to these experiments in Dark Souls 1 through Crossbreed Priscilla and Sif the Scaleless. We learn through dialogue that Sif was conducting experiments. We get to see the Snake Man and Piascas in the Duke's archives. And Priscilla was called a half-dragon in Japanese, which is a lot more specific than Crossbreed, making it relatively easy to put these parts together. So, the standing theory has always been that Sif created Priscilla, but we've never known exactly how or why he did it. The explanation has always been brushed aside as he was crazy and he made crazy experiments. And that was fine in Dark Souls 1 because there were no more leads to point us in the right direction. But then we got Yorshka, and soon after we got the Painter Girl, both of which looked a lot like crossbreeds. Suddenly we had not just more leads but also more questions. What are they? Where do they come from? If they're all crossbreeds, then did Sif create them as well? Why is Yorshka saying she's Gwyn's daughter? Who is the Painter Girl's mother that she refers to? What I've proposed before is that yes, Sif created all of them, and their mothers were goddesses of Honor Londo. I deduced that Priscilla was Gwynevere's daughter because of her size and the placement of the painted word of Ariamis within a room with a giant statue of Gwynevere. I also made another detailed connection in my Let There Be Dark video that you can check out if you haven't. Yorshka would have been Filianor's, and she would have hatched from the egg that Filianor is holding. Her dialogue says Gwyndolin named her, and Gwyndolin clearly had access to Filianor, judging by the engravings on the doors of Filianor's church. Then, since both the Ringed City and Filianor herself are secrets, Gwyndolin couldn't tell her about her mother, so Yorshka was told she was Gwyndolin's sister instead of a niece. It explains the sudden appearance of this new royal family member, and it also explains the egg that Filianor is holding. And the Painter Girl was Velka's. I've talked about that in the Fire for Ariandel and Non-Warrior Nox videos, so please check those out as well. And the last crossbreed would be Gwyndolin. In retrospect, it should be pretty clear that Gwyndolin is a crossbreed. The Snakefit should have been a dead giveaway. And I would posit that another layer to help support this idea is the charade that was built around Gwyndolin to protect its identity by disguising its gender. Gwyndolin's model had breasts, and the lore said that Gwyndolin was a boy raised as a girl due to his affinity to moonlight magic, but that is a lie. He never uses any moonlight magic, except for his moonlight arrows, but that's not the same thing. Anyone can shoot those arrows. Also, moonlight magic is associated with sorcery, and Gwyndolin himself is called a moon sorcerer, but his staff scales with faith, not intelligence, and his crown is also said to demand faith immeasurable of its wearer, meaning they gave him these items so he could pass as a sorcerer, even though he had more affinity to miracles, as would be expected from a deity. So, if Gwyndolin wasn't an innate sorcerer and had no affinity to moon magic as far as we can tell, then why go through all this trouble? Gwyndolin wasn't raised as a girl. Gwyndolin was a girl, period. If all crossbreeds are girls, Yorshka, Priscilla and the Painter are all girls, after all, then Gwyndolin was said to be a boy, so the charade could help distance her from the Crossbreed Experiments. The moon magic farce is real and observable in-game. The Crossbreed Experiments provide a reason for it. So these are the crossbreeds, but what is the purpose of these experiments? Well, that's never stated, but it can be inferred. It used to be just Sif and Priscilla, but now that the other gods are involved, then it becomes an institutional effort. And the only reason I can think of as to why they did such a thing is survival. They knew the first flame would go out eventually. They even had a prophecy about it in the Titanet's labs of the giant blacksmith deity. So, crossbreeding gods with beings that don't require the first flame, such as dragons, could be the only way to safeguard their survival as a species, and the power they held over the world. And that would have been Sif's reason too, since his immortality hinged on the Primordial Crystal which, as we all know, could be very easily destroyed. I had been thinking about Shira for a while. I was under the impression she may have been a crossbreed using humans, since it doesn't really make sense for her to be Sif's biological daughter. Sif was called a true undead by Logan. He achieved true immortality, and the source of his immortality was the Primordial Crystal. Logan is said to have found the quintessence of sorcery inside this crystal, and homing soul mass alludes to a connection between Logan's sorcery and the dark. Carhillion of the Fold as well, in Dark Souls 2, helps corroborate this connection when he says, "I sense a dark power here, something akin to sorcery, only more primordial." So, the quintessence of sorcery inside the crystal that turned Sif into a true undead would have been the dark. If that was the key to his immortality, it could be the key to unlocking true immortality for the gods as well. That could be the key for the Crossbreed Experiments, and we do see that in action, since all that were involved seem to have been tainted by the dark to some degree. Priscilla's dagger had occult damage, and the old dragon slayer, who was associated with Gwynevere, had dark powers instead of lightning. The painter girl is using the blood of the dark soul, and Velka's rapier had occult damage, just like Priscilla's dagger. And there's also the Velka's transformation theory I described in Non-Warrior Nox. Gwendolyn's Dark Moon Blade has a purple hue, which is largely associated with dark miracles, and Rosaria, whom I believe to be Fina, that is, Gwen's wife, has an invading covenant which is associated with the dark through Kaf and the Dark Raves. And if you need further explanation regarding Rosaria, then check out Primordial Flame and Non-Warrior Nox as well. And finally, Yorshka was born from an egg that seems to have been corrupted by the dark, and Filianor has dark tendrils that would imply corruption as well. It stands to reason that if humans would be able to survive without the first flame due to their connection to the abyss, then said connection could play a key role in the gods' attempts to outlive the flame as well. Shira's presence in the Ringed City gives Sif access to the pygmies, meaning he could have been experimenting with the Dark Soul directly, maybe from the very beginning, which also opens up a very interesting possibility. What if men were created by the gods? We're supposed to have come from the Dark Soul itself, but we're never told how. How did humans come from pygmies? There was one pygmy and one Dark Soul, then there were many. What we see here is just division, which is similar to mitosis. Under these circumstances, the pygmy kings could be seen as clones of the furtive pygmy, and this division of his soul could help explain how Gwyn would later be able to split his own soul into shards, one of which was given to Sif himself. Then, Sif would have moved to something akin to meiosis, and that would have created the first man, with humanity being like a lesser, incomplete version of the Dark Soul. They used the first man as expendable front lines in their war against the ancient dragons, but holding all this knowledge pertinent to the race of man, they soon realized our full potential. They would perish, and we would endure. It's a war of attrition that they cannot hope to win. So they created the Ring of Fire, but the Ring of Fire wasn't placed on the First Men themselves, it was placed on their armors and weapons. So Sif would ensure that further division would create a species that had that sign branded directly onto them. Shira would have been the prototype, kept in the Ringed City, looking over her somewhat kindred First Man and the mad Pygmy King. She's conveniently kept out of sight, and her supposed divine lineage keeps her in line. Man was their best attempt at curbing out the power creep of the rapidly multiplying offspring of the Dark Soul, but the power they had unleashed could not be so easily contained. In this scenario, creating the race of man was not a byproduct of the Crossbreed Experiments. It was a war effort, but Sif's experiments with the Dark Soul would later become one of the catalysts for the Crossbreed Experiments. After mitosis and meiosis, the next step would be actual crossbreeds which, in biology, could be called chimeras. The next step is amalgamation. We're looking for amalgamation, and one particular instance of it that piqued my interest was the chimera-looking sanctuary guardian. His soul describes it as being no ordinary beast, but rather closer to the beings known as demons. In Japanese, the word they translated as ordinary is shizen, which means natural. They were implying that the guardian was created rather than born, just like the demons were created by Izalith's chaos flame. The guardian is an amalgamation exhibiting, and I quote, traits of several animals other than lions. It's actually a very blunt reference when you think about it. The guardian is further associating amalgamation with chaos by comparing it to demons, but we already had the likes of Kelag and the Fair Lady, who are half spiders, for instance. And one thing some people don't realize, I think, is that the Fair Lady and Kelag weren't exactly working with the Bed of Chaos and the rest of Izalith. In Eingid's words, they fled Izalith. They're not necessarily against Izalith, and I really don't think they are, but they're not working with them either. So what are they doing? And I've seen people theorize that the Fair Lady became a Firekeeper to cure her illness, but that doesn't really work. You see, the Fair Lady's eggs were cradles for humanities which her followers fed to her, but they came to be after she became a Firekeeper, judging by the description. To her, the countless eggs which appeared were cradles for each tiny humanity. And she became a Firekeeper before falling to illness, since at one point she says that the eggs have gone still, meaning that they were fine before. So, how and why did she become a Firekeeper in the first place? And why did the two of them have to leave Izalith? Well, I think they made a deal with the gods. I think they were helping Sif's experiments. If you've seen my videos, you may recall I've mentioned a relief found in the Undead Parish in Dark Souls 1, next to a statue that I believe to be of Fina, in front of which the body of a dead Firekeeper has been laid to rest. Okay. The relief depicts a lion, a couple of goats, and a man delivering an egg. The egg represents the Crossbreed Experiments, Priscilla, Yarshka, Gwendolyn, and the Painter Girl, all born from eggs. And in order to deliver these eggs, to complete this experiment, the key is the amalgamation of divine, chaos, and the dark. The man obviously stands for the dark. The lion, I believe, represents the divine. The only two instances I can recall of references to lions in the game are Ornstein, a god, and the Ferocialionites, who worship a god of war which is, in turn, largely assumed to be the Nameless King. That, plus the Guardian, who is mostly lion and shoots lightning, which is, divine. And the goats are heavily associated with demons. I mean, there's the Capra demon, and Capra is literally a genus that includes goats. And the Guardian, again, also has goat/demon-like horns. And there's more. In Non-Warrior Nox, I had associated Fina to the Firekeepers, and in Dark Souls 1, we have 4 Firekeepers. The Fair Lady, associated to Chaos, Anastasia and the Lady of the Darkling, who are both associated to humans and the undead, and also to Unorlondo and the gods, with both being associated to Fina in some respect. And the 4th Firekeeper is dead in Sif's manor, in a cell, along with Sif's other experiments. Sif really was conducting experiments on Firekeepers. And don't forget the Man-Eater shells in Ash Lake, connecting Sif to the area surrounding Kelag's domain. The Ash Lake itself conveniently housing an actual ancient dragon who's left alone, despite Sif apparently knowing about its whereabouts, judging by the aforementioned Man-Eater shells. It's all in the name of the Crossbreed Experiments, their best attempt to avoid extinction. Sif lacked the immortal scales of his kin and relied on the Primordial Crystal, while the demons had to rely on the Chaos Flame and the Bed of Chaos, but those aren't really very good backup plans, as the Chosen Undead has so undeniably shown. So, the demons of Izalith and the gods of Unorlondo, for whom the sun would eventually set forever, attempted to create a new breed for their kinds, and I think the Piaskas show that Sif also meant to apply these experiments to himself, since their tentacles show he was making Sif crossbreeds, and, like I said, the Primordial Crystal really isn't a fail-proof source of immortality. And then, as one last example, we have the Mad King, Shura's malformed, immortal pygmy ward. I believe he was a failure resulting from Sif's experimentations with the Dark Soul and the Chaos Flame, which is known to the form creatures. So, this is the evidence for the Crossbreed Experiments, which had a much larger scale than was originally implied. These experiments may sound like a side note, but their consequences are far-reaching, starting of course with man, but also for the gods themselves, since I believe that the corruption of the crossbreeds had a role into why Velka and Fina supported the occult rebellion, and why Gwynevere left Unorlondo. It determined the fate of all these mothers and their daughters, and it was also the foundation for the unkindled experiments that I've talked about in previous videos, which leads to the actual end of the whole story in Dark Souls 3. So, yeah, good old Dark Souls. Everything is lore, all the lore is connected, and all lore is important. And before I leave, I want to indulge in 2 big tangents, if I may. Kind of continuing on the same subject, I've mentioned before my belief that Vendrick was groomed by Nashandra to become a Dark Lord, and at the end of my Primordial Flame video, I used his dialogue to show that Dark Souls 2 was foreshadowing the usurpation of fire in Dark Souls 3.
With fire, they say, a true king can harness the curse. A lie, but I knew no better. Seeker of fire, you know not the depth of dark within you. It grows deeper still, the more flame you covet. With dark unshackled, a curse will be upon us, and men will take their true shape.
I didn't say anything, I just put the dialogue there and hoped people would pick up on it. Maybe I should have said something, but either way, what I want to point out now is that while foreshadowing the distant future, his dialogue was also describing the distant past. he talks about using fire to harness the curse, and that's exactly what they were doing. Izalith wielded fire-based sorcery, which is now forgotten. The Izalith staff says that, with the birth of the Chaos Flame, the Flame Witches were at once both sorcerers and shamans, and also that the staff seems to boost the power of dark sorceries. So, I think that she would have used her fire sorcery to try and harness the dark in her attempt to recreate the first flame. There are the dark sign and the ring of fire placed upon the first man that sever their connection to the abyss. It's not a ring of lightning, it's a ring of fire, and I think that is Izalith playing a hand in Gwyn's plans, and I think that is Izalith's starting point to her later, more ambitious endeavors. Then we have Sif, who, as I have shown, would be using chaos to harness the dark in his Crossbreed Experiments. There's also the humanity sprites. They kinda look like dark, enveloped in a layer of soul material. It's like they have used souls to contain the dark. And souls are born from the first flame, so, again, using fire to harness the curse. In this sense, the term Shackle of the Gods would apply to both the fire rings and the soul layer around humanity, as they are all connected and ultimately serve the same purpose. This also harkens back to Sif in his soul sorcery. Okay, try to visualize it in layers. According to the Dark Souls 1 intro, we all came from the dark. The Japanese subtitles even go as far as saying that they were born in the dark. So even the gods would, at least at some point, have had the dark inside of them. The first flame and its fiery looking souls would have suppressed the dark. You can try and picture it as a humanity sprite with a soul layer so thick that you can't even see the dark anymore. Alright, now dark and soul sorcery. Dark sorceries are reminiscent in appearance to humanity sprites, having darkness encased in a white, soul-like material. Soul sorcery, on the other hand, usually has a white core enveloped by a residual light blue energy. The Primordial Crystal holds the quintessence of sorcery, that is, darkness. Dark sorcery focuses on that dark layer, and Sif would have used the power of souls to harness that energy in the form of soul sorcery. The Primordial Crystal itself is another example of this idea in action, since souls are known to crystallize, and crystal sorcery is even an evolution of soul sorcery, so, after a fashion, the crystal containing the dark is equal to souls containing the dark. And we can apply this framework to soul and human drags as well. First, I'd like to thank Sinclair and Egon. I was watching their old podcast, and his remark that judging by its artificial appearance, it kinda looked like the deep gem could have been extracted from humanity, rather than formed spontaneously, got me thinking, and, well, I had actually also been thinking about Ingvard, being able to heal curses and taking humanities as payment, which always seemed a bit weird, and I've arrived at the conclusion that he was probably transferring the curse into the humanities. And then Egon's remark made me think of Grendel, and how he took payments in human effigies, and how that always kind of struck me as being weird too. So, if you compare the appearance of human and soul drags to humanity sprites, it kinda looks like the soul layer has been removed. It's either missing or really fuzzy at best. I don't know how exactly they would have done it, but I think Grendel taking your effigies symbolizes a process of removing that layer, removing the soul part and leaving only the dark. as the effigy was used to prevent hollowing, especially since the Japanese description says that there is a darkness that humans can't reach, instead of saying it's beyond human ken. Dark Orb and Black Fire Orb both allude to dark possessing a certain weight to it, and without the soul layer to keep it afloat, the dregs would sink. The mercmen who rise from the abyss can burst out a great soul drag, which leaves. It's powerful, but it leaves. Humanities could exist outside the abyss. Maybe drags can't because of their missing layer of souls. They would need a host. The Herald Knights, for instance, made it into the swamp, drowned, and came back as soul drags hosts. It's still a bit fuzzy on the details, but this explains what drags are, why they sink, and it also fits with all the theories I've been presenting about the chasm of O being the abyss and the deep being its bottom. Alright, I have 3 notes to mention before I wrap this up. First, regarding the Ringed City and Sif's experiments, there's Meteor. Not yet sure how and if he fits with the experiments, but an actual dragon able to absorb dark energy and humanity seems a bit suspicious given his location. Also suspicious is that they seem to have been dumping bodies in his lair. I think it's generally assumed those bodies came from the swamp, but there are buildings sinking there too, which means that used to be solid ground. The hole in the room with the primordial serpent statues and Lothric banners, on the other hand, could be used to throw down bodies at any point in time. And if you go to the edges of Meteor's arena and look closely at those bodies, you'll notice that they seem to have a mark painted across their chests. I think they had been marked as undead and thrown down there to have their humanity consumed by Meteor. Again, not sure how or if that fits with the experiments, but I think it was worth noting. Second, when I talk about the in-game references to lions, I left out the Lion Clan from Dark Souls 2 because their whole situation will be mentioned in another video. And lastly, I had mentioned before my theory that Sif may have been a female, considering that moon sorcery, which is associated to Sif via the Moonlight Sword, was used as an excuse to dub Gwynevere as a girl. Like, if Sif wasn't female, then moon sorcery wouldn't justify raising a boy as a girl, right? So, my friend John cooked up another argument to help back up my theories, pointing out that if the Crossbreed Experiments were all born from female goddesses, and if Sif had used his own DNA in the process, then, at least according to human genetics logic, both parents would have provided X chromosomes, which would invariably create female offspring, explaining why all crossbreeds ended up being girls. So, yeah, that's it. First video in a long ass while. I've been sitting on this stuff for over a year now. Hopefully, I'll start making videos on a regular basis again, because I have more stuff that I'm sitting on. Let me know what you think about the theories, and thanks to everyone who's subscribed to the channel over the past few months and left me comments as well, even though I wasn't really uploading any content. It means a lot to me. As this video comes out, my Patreon may still be on hold, but thanks to everyone who's ever supported me there, as always. Vinny, the first patron, Wow, Ethan, my good friend John, and Lady Sinclair, who sounds so Goddamn kawaii, I suspect she might be an anime character sometimes. Alright, that's enough. I'll stop talking now. See you around.